Welcome to the afternoon second session of the panel discussions, which one is going to be on sustainable cities. It gives me pleasure to welcome our moderator for the next session. It is Fiona Harvey, who is an environmental journalist with The Guardian. She has worked previously with the Financial Times, has covered issues ranging from the Arctic to the Amazon, and has interviewed persons of fame as Ban Ki-moon, Tony Blair, Al Gore, and Jeff Inlet. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Fiona.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And yes, as you've just been told, I've been covering the environment specifically for more than 10 years now. And in all of that time, we have talked extensively about sustainable cities and about how important it is that our cities should become more sustainable. Now, 20 years ago, that meant getting people to do things like recycling. Then it meant looking at renewable power for cities. It meant looking at how we can build cities better, how we can design cities better so that people don't have to follow this old model that grew up in the sort of post-war in the 1950s, where people would live in suburbs and commute centrally to their work, and thereby produce a lot of carbon emissions. We looked at ways to design cities differently, and we looked at ways in which cities themselves, their natural resources, such as the water, the rivers, which we can see from the window here in this case, their green spaces, their biodiversity, could all be improved. Because for a long time, in the post-war period, when cities were growing up, many of the cities that we have today, these issues were neglected. Today we face even bigger problems, because today we're looking at the development of megacities around the world. We're looking at many cities around the world, hundreds of cities that in the future are going to have. We are talking about, in the post-war period, we were talking about cities with a few million inhabitants. Now we're talking about cities with at least 10 million inhabitants becoming megacities around the world. And at the moment, the way in which megacities are growing up is that you'll have an original city, and you'll have people joining that city from the countryside, from suburbs and so on, who swell the city's population but live in appalling conditions often, in slum conditions, in shanty towns and so on. So sustainable cities need to take that on board. In 2007, the United Nations announced, for the first time, we believe, in human history, more people were living in towns and cities than were living in the countryside. That's an amazing change which we really haven't got to grips with yet. So these are the things we haven't done. We haven't made our existing cities more sustainable. We haven't made our megacities, which are growing up rapidly all around us, all over the world. We haven't made those megacities sustainable, because at the moment people are just joining them and living in slums, as I said. And thirdly, we really haven't taken account of the growth of cities as revealed by that UN survey in 2007. We haven't taken account of the fact that more of us are living in cities than the countryside, and how are we going to deal with that? Cities can be sustainable. We know that because actually carbon emissions from well-run cities can often be less than from people living in the countryside. You can see that even around Cambridge. We know that cities can be a haven for biodiversity. We've had numerous cities around the world. In London, there's a fantastic example of some peregrine falcons that have come back to nest in central London. I mean, what a wonderful thing that is, when they've been absent for so many years. Now you can fish for salmon in the Thames. It's great. There are wonderful success stories. But we need to have more success stories and less failures. So that's why we're here. And that's why we've got this wonderful array of panelists here today who are going to tell you about how we can make cities more sustainable, and you are then going to interrogate them as to their ideas and as to how we can put this into practice. Because one of the wonderful things about Gates scholars is that, as I know, you are all immensely practical people. You're not coming here to kind of, to just think about ideas that you'll talk about for an evening and then they never happen. You're here to put ideas into practice. So that's what we're here to do. So let me introduce our panel. We've got Simon Giles, who's joining us from Accenture. We've got Linda Gichuyia, who's joining us. She's here from Nairobi today, which is fantastic, and who's a Gates alumna, I think I should say, yeah. And we've got Diane Haigh, who's a professional architect who's worked in this area for a long time. So we're going to get the benefit of their experience now. First of all, I have to excuse myself. I don't have a watch at the moment. It broke, and I don't have a clock here. So I'm going to be relying on the lovely assistant and on my BlackBerry. So if I'm using my BlackBerry, that's why. So apologies for that. Simon, if you'd like to address us first.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me this afternoon. Unbelievably, this is my first time in Cambridge, UK. I seem to spend every kind of 1 week in every 6 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but this is my first time in Cambridge, so it's lovely to be here. Firstly, can I just ask a question of the audience? How many of the audience are either architects or would consider themselves to be urbanists by training or by profession? One. Is that one? Fantastic. And how many of you have considered cities and how your profession or your interests relate specifically to cities and are interested in the development of cities professionally, kind of going forwards? Okay. So I guess as a way of introduction, I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an urbanist. I'm a practitioner in this field. I've been practicing in this field for about the last 6 years. I'm by training an economist and a philosopher. And I came into this field specifically because I thought I could make a difference. And I looked from the outside in on architects and urbanists, and from what I saw, I thought there's a large gap in the marketplace here for somebody with a completely different set of skills. And what I'll try and do in the next 10 minutes or so is explain 2 angles of the type of work I do, and my team does. And hopefully I'll convince some of you that actually there's a role for you to play in this field, which is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. And it needs to become increasingly interdisciplinary. So I'm the biggest evangelist for non-architects, engineers, and urbanists to come into this field, because I think we can make a big difference to the agenda overall. So in terms of the question about sustainability, I guess one thing that I've always done in the last 6 years is try to focus the sustainability debate within cities, not just on environmental sustainability, but thinking much more broadly about the question of sustainability within the context of cities and what our future cities should look like. So thinking not just about environmental sustainability, but also thinking about the social fabric and social sustainability, but also economic sustainability of a city. How's the economy of our cities going to evolve over time? How do we deal with post-industrialism and also the development of cities whose economies are based around the creative and knowledge economies? And how do cities make that transition between an industrial and a post-industrial and then a knowledge and creative economy? So the work that we've also done is tried to focus on the role of digital technologies within the concept of the city and the structure of the city. So thinking about cities not just from the perspective of the architecture and the physical fabric of the city, or in terms of the policy structures and the institutions of the city, but what's the role of the city in terms of defining and developing a digital economy and a digital function for the city. So in terms of the 2 types of work that we do, it's really split about 50-50 between new build master planning and working with cities on trying to understand the city's role in defining the information and digital economy. So I'll start with the first one first, in terms of master planning. So traditionally, the way that master planning has worked within a city and the development of new parts of a city is that either real estate developers or the city itself identify areas of the city for redevelopment. They understand what the current real estate prices are within the city. They identify whether there's a business case for doing a redevelopment within the city. And then quite quickly they move into physical mode. They start understanding what are the infrastructure requirements in order to create a development, but also what the physical architecture and the physical, what does the physical fabric of that new development within the city need to look like. And it's amazingly fast, especially in developing economies, from the identification of a real estate transaction to an RFP going out, a request for a proposal to go out to an architect, or a competition to go to an architect to develop a physical manifestation, a master plan for the city. But what we haven't seen is a much more integrated and interdisciplinary approach. And what we've tried to bring into the equation is a different perspective on master planning that starts with the premise of how can we create sections of this city that are going to function as an information economy or as an economy full stop. How is this part of the city going to make money? How's it going to contribute economically to the focus of the city? And what kind of people are going to be required to come and fill both the commercial and the residential real estate within the site? So if you look back to the period of the late 90s and the beginning of this century, where money and credit was cheap, the build it and they will come model of development was prevalent. You know, people could go out, get cheap money for development, build large condominium complexes and cheap commercial real estate, and they would pretty much know that it was going to get utilized. And it was a money-making venture. People would get into the transaction and they would exit the transaction as fast as they could. But nowadays, that paradigm doesn't work quite as well. Because if you don't have people physically moving to the city, and there's no compelling reason to move to the city, then the real estate developer can be underwater really, really fast. So what we've been trying to position is that this new paradigm that focuses on how will it function as an economy. Is it going to be an industrial development? Is it going to be a knowledge development? Is it going to focus on the creative industries? And then importantly, how do you create an economic ecosystem around that? So if we're talking about a creative or a knowledge cluster, what does that mean in terms of intellectual property creation, both within universities but also within the startup field of applied research? How are we going to generate new intellectual property, new ideas? How are we going to take those ideas and then incubate them into small and medium-sized enterprises? And when we do have small and medium-sized enterprises, startups developing within this zone, how are we going to get those ideas to scale and get them to market? So what big businesses are required in order to develop supply chains and routes to market for those big developments? Now, that creates an ecosystem, an economic ecosystem, but it also has a requirement for talent. So what we try to understand is, if I want somebody to move from Portland, Oregon to Guadalajara in Mexico to work in a new creative development cluster, what kind of conversation is that man or woman going to have with his or her partner when they go home in the evening and say, honey, I think we need to move to Guadalajara? Right? The first question will be, well, what about the kids? You know, is it going to be safe? What about their education? What about healthcare? You know, what are the lists of questions and discussion points they're going to have? And how do we create a master plan that delivers services that enable a lifestyle within that city that is compelling to a potential commercial investor or a residential customer or a residential citizen? So what we've tried to base our master planning approach around is kind of this approach of trying to deliver a lifestyle, understand the lifestyle of potential citizens, and then what services are required and how we develop the services. And it's only then that we start thinking about the physical architecture, the physical fabric of the city to enable a lifestyle to be lived or a service to be delivered. But on an equal footing with the physical architecture, we tried to think about the digital architecture. You know, what digital infrastructure is required to enable people to live the lifestyles that they want to live? And if we're building cities for the next 40 or 50 years, we've got to be thinking about those cities as fundamentally digital as well as physical, because people live at least as much of their life online as they do offline. So it only stands to reason that you have to include both digital and physical services within that construct. So we've tried to develop this much more integrated and holistic approach where we're not just dealing with architects and engineers, but we're trying to understand through a social anthropology perspective and through applied economics, how do we bring those different disciplines into this master planning discipline as a whole? So that's about half of the work that I do. The second half of the work that we do is try to answer the question of what is the role of the modern day city in the information economy and in market making the information economy. It was very clear what the role of the city was in the industrial economy. And we created sources of production, we created infrastructure to move goods and services around the city, and we dealt with the domestic and residential real estate requirements to service those businesses. So it was very clear what the role of the city was in the industrial economy. But as we move into the information economy, when I go out and talk to cities around the world, they seem to be of the opinion that that's the role of the private sector, right? The private sector and commercial business is running the information economy. And there is no role for the city other than providing access to broadband and providing access to fiber connectivity. And I guess it's kind of my contention that there is a much broader role for the information economy within a city. At one level, that's about providing open data, and some of you may have heard about the open data movement. And London is probably one of the main protagonists globally in driving the open data movement. So taking information from government and making it available for third parties to use. But it goes way beyond the concept of just the city or government providing access to data on the functioning of the city. It's about the city acting as a protagonist in getting private sector companies that own data relating to the city to provide access to that data. And to give an example of why that's important, right? I was in Singapore this week, and a great example of what a digital city looks like is Singapore. And if any of you have been to Singapore, one of the biggest challenges is getting taxis, right? Getting a taxi in the late afternoon when there are rainstorms, thunderstorms is almost impossible. But in order to make it easier, there's an easy way of doing that with digital technology. I take accurate rainfall radar data from the Meteorological Office. That's provided by government, and it can be provided as an open data source. However, I also need to know the real-time location of where the taxis are, right? So as part of the licensing conditions, you can require taxis to carry GPS transmitters, right? Then I know exactly where the taxis are. But the third data set that I need is I need to understand where the people are, right? Now, cell phone companies or mobile phone companies have operational data sets on how many people are logged on to any cell phone mast at any point in time. Now, that gives you a pretty decent proxy for real-time population density in the city. So it can give you a view of where are the centers of population at any given point in time. Now, if I take those three disparate data sets owned by three different parties, and I perform an algorithm on it that enables me to optimize the location of the taxi in advance of a rainstorm to centers of population, then there's a very clear purpose and utility. Taxi companies can get better utilization of their fleet, but also people get a better standard of service. But who is going to act as the market maker for that to happen? And it's my contention that there is a role for the city in developing that. And by making that data available, they'll make the cities more sustainable, both economically, environmentally, and socially.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that idea. And perhaps in Cambridge, we could have taxi services that perhaps were more aware of some of the jams that carry on around the time. No, I'm very interested in these ideas, and perhaps this idea of more cities being virtual could ease a lot of problems in cities, because if we do more of our work virtually, then people don't need to commute as much. Then they have less carbon emissions, and we have less pollution and so on, and less congestion, and people's lives become easier. But we do also still have to deal with the built environment as well as the digital environment. So we've got to have kind of both of those together. And also, it strikes me that that the issues around cities for the rural population are also a key concern in the digital age, because at the moment in the UK we have a very big issue around broadband for people living in rural areas. And so, perhaps more people could engage in such a digital lifestyle if there weren't these constraints in getting, modern technology out to other areas. So that's something to think about. Right, we're going to move on now to Linda, who's, I think you've got a presentation for us. Yeah, thank you.
The small technology labs. Thank you all for coming, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about a subject I feel so passionately about, a subject that has been part of my research for the last 2-3 years now, and hopefully get to share with you a few insights in this very topical issue of sustainable cities, and specifically sustainable building in developing countries and emerging economies, which is very central to my research. And the reason why I have decided to look at sustainability in developing countries is designers in these countries have a challenge. And the challenge is to design to achieve habitable conditions of space, one, and to also to meet the aspirations of a fast-developing, fast-growing society that has so many needs, and all this within the confines of very limited resources geared towards reducing our carbon emission in the fast urbanization process. And there's therefore need to deliberate on decisions that we need to make, and what we have now, and decisions that we need to make to ensure that this urban growth, this urban development happens within the confines of sustainable development. Next. And I want to draw your attention to sustainability at a building scale. Well, Simon Giles here gave you the big picture. I want to draw your attention to sustainability at a building scale and get to discuss, mainly introduce, because this is a very broad topic, introduce what sustainable building really means in a carbon-constrained environment in a developing country. Yeah, that is zooming in. Next. And well, it's been all over international news recently about the latest UN IPCC report that states with 95% certainty that human activities are the principal cause of climate change. That is mainly activities that produce CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas related emissions that is causing global warming. And you'll agree with me that we are living in an era of publicized pressure to a low carbon society, an era of green patriotism where most of our activities are geared towards reducing our carbon emissions less pressure to our depleting resources, environmental conservation, and etc. And what does this mean for buildings? And what does this mean for buildings, especially when buildings are said to play the greatest contributory role to these emissions? Reports suggest that a third of the CO2 and greenhouse-related gases causing climate change comes from buildings. That is between 30 to 40%, depending on the countries. And there are, for the last 2-3 years, I've been studying the relationship between buildings and climate change. And there exists this very interesting relationship between the two, where in so many ways, one is the cause and effect of the other. So I'm going to explain this very colorful image we have here. On one hand, buildings contribute immensely to greenhouse gases that cause climate change. And on the other hand, climate change is expected to affect buildings in so many ways, mostly through more energy use and therefore more carbon emissions. So it's a cyclic link. And just to talk a bit about this image is the production side. I don't have the pointer, but the production side right on the left-hand side corner. Buildings form a large percentage of energy used in society, mostly the production of building materials and in maintaining the habitable conditions of space. So in the production of raw materials, it's in the form of embodied energy carbon. That is, if you pull apart each and every building material or component, of this space, for example, say glass, and study its life cycle, right from when the materials were mined, how much energy was used to mine these materials, how much energy was used to transport these materials to the factories, for production, assembly, how much energy is used to transport these building materials to site, how much energy is used to put the building up, and back out a bit and multiply this by the number of times that material is replaced throughout the building's lifetime, which could easily reach between 50 to 100 years. How many times do you repaint? How many times do you replace your panels and all this sort of thing? And that is what constitutes embodied energy carbon. And we also have operational energy carbon emission, that is from the day-to-day runnings of spaces like cooling during the summer, heating during the winter time, lighting, equipment use, and all that is what the embodied energy and operational energy carbon is what forms a third of this CO2 greenhouse gas emissions that cause global warming. Causing global warming, then climate change leads to, impacts buildings in so many ways, mostly from, it's widely expected that climate change will lead to increase in temperature. And that means more energy is used to cool the spaces during the summer, yes, and throughout in the tropical climates like Kenya, where I come from, and hence more energy resources, and the cycle continues, and this cycle continues and grows out as time goes on, because more as the climate keeps on changing and warming up, more energy is used to cool and keeps on growing. Next slide. And therefore, there's need to see ways in which to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation strategies geared towards reducing the embodied energy carbon and operational energy carbon on one hand, and on the other hand, design buildings that can be adjusted to the changing effects of climate change. And it's very tricky to balance these two issues, because there are some adaptation strategies that impact and add on to the embodied energy carbon. And there are strategies that deal with reduce the operational energy carbon, but increase the embodied energy carbon on the other side. And it's really hard to achieve that balance, but we need to do it within the limited resources that we have. Next. And some of the big questions are, are low energy, what we have right now, low energy, eco, net zero. I'm sure you've heard all these good names. Eco-friendly buildings, future-proofed to deal with these changing effects. These changing effects within the confines of our resources, without counteracting our attempts to cut emissions. And what does this mean for developing and emerging economies? And what my research tries to answer, these are some of the questions my current research tries to answer, is how do we then strike this balance between mitigation and adaptation without counteracting attempts to cut emission in the urbanization process in these countries? And second, how do you make these decisions under uncertainty and unpredictability of a developing country? And bearing in mind that their unpredictability is quite random compared to uncertainty in a developed country, and uncertainty in economic development, in political changes everywhere. And how do you make decisions under all these uncertainties? And third and most important question is, how do you ensure the longevity of the building performance once you've struck that balance? Because we design buildings now for a future that we know nothing about. And it's a future, it's a long life, a building has a long service life, between 50, 100 years plus, or 200. And within that time, this building undergoes, or it's influenced and impacted. There's so many different developments that happen. Changes in, as I say, the economy, social economic change, political change, legal change, technological advances. And not only that, but there's also the uncertainty in the variability of these building-related features that affect building performance. And what I mean by that is it's uncertain that how the boundary conditions of this building will be in the next 2, 3, 100 years, for example. Climate is changing. That means changing temperature, changing humidity, changing atmospheric pressure, changing wind speeds, and all this has an effect of how much energy used to either cool the space during the summer. And it's not only the climate change that's happening, global warming, but in a developing country's context, the urban context keeps on changing. So, like, we just passed a new constitution in Kenya recently, and we now have a devolved government. So we're going to see development happening in rural areas where, there was no development at all. And in these rural areas, we have these freestanding buildings that have been there for years. But what's going to happen in the next 5, 10 years? We'll have the urban context changing. Tall buildings coming up, short buildings, and it's all random and unpredictable. And all this affects the urban climate, the microclimate, on top of the climate change that's happening, that's also unpredictable. And not only the boundary context, how we dress the spaces, for example. The way this space is right now, if this building is still standing in the next 200 years, it could be changed to an office block. And probably the client will want to have a bigger window or a smaller window. And all these changes in its structure, in its use, for example, like today we have 1 million of us here, tomorrow we'll have only one, or the next day we'll have probably someone having huge gaming machines here. We never know. And all this has an effect on performance. And how do you then make decisions, ensure longevity of building performance within of these strategies that we have in place for a long period of time without counteracting our attempts to cut emissions? And with all that, after answering all these questions, what I hopefully hope to achieve after my PhD is this will aid in identifying and appraisal of potential routes towards energy efficiency in these countries under those conditions. And not only identify, but most importantly, prioritize these strategies. Prioritization is very, very important and critical, especially prioritizing according to their effectiveness levels and their urgency levels. And investigate whether these priorities, after ranking them, these priorities work in this year, prioritize them and study whether these priorities change over time. And answer questions like, how often do we need to change our building code? And building code, and this will help in targeting resources, limited resources that we have, allocation of those resources, identify possible areas of technological advancements, and also aid in knowing when we need these things to happen, setting building regulations, as I said, updating the building codes, and identifying ways, to end on a high note, identify ways of exploiting opportunities presented by the future climate. Yeah, I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So now we've had a sort of a big picture idea about digital cities, and we've had a very focused idea about actual buildings and how we cope with that. And a question that we might like to consider in the Q&A afterwards is, how come we're actually still building buildings that aren't energy efficient, that aren't sort of climate adaptive? I mean, it seems to me astonishing that we're still doing that kind of thing. We're still building cities that aren't future-proofed. But perhaps we can address that afterwards. We're going to hear now from Diane Haigh, who's, as I said before, a professional architect who's been working in this space for some time. And we're going to have a very particular case study here, which speaks to me particularly. Yeah.
All these people will go through King's Cross, so I know I'm speaking to an audience that knows all about this project, and you'll have watched it.
Fantastic.
Go past. I think you might just have to set my slides just to roll, and I'll catch up on. I mean, not too fast, but you know this place, so just do and why I'm talking about King's Cross is because sustainability is right at the heart of this project. And I think there are really interesting lessons. It's a really high-profile project, as you all know. It's very visible. It was a project waiting to happen on a brownfield site, very polluted land. But we have quite a few of these in London at the moment. You know, there's the legacy site of the Olympics, the 2012 Olympics. There's places like Nine Elms, where the new US Embassy is going to be. That is developing right now. This is the site as it is at the minute. And you can see it being built out. You will watch that from the train as you go through. And that was the site before it started, before they even did the St Pancras Hall there. And you can see the amount of dereliction there, the amount of spoil, the amount of remediation of ground that there has had to be. We can hardly remember it now. The first thing that's great about this site, and I've got 5 aspects of sustainable urbanism that I'm just going to talk about, that would apply to lots of sites. This is a supremely accessible site, probably the most accessible site in the UK. It's got, of course, national and international trains coming into not only King's Cross and St Pancras, but also Euston, just down the road. It's got 6 tube stations very close by, so that it's very accessible. You can get up and down the country, but also over to Europe with an international high-speed rail line. It's got 14 bus lines going past it, and it's getting an 800-space bike interchange as part of it. That's all the underground lines and the bus. But it's not only the vehicular connections, it's also to do with the walking environment in the site, and we'll see something of that. That red line shows the extent of the King's Cross redevelopment site before it started. I'm sure one can hardly think back to what it was like and the degree of dereliction there and the degree of land remediation. Now just whiz through these, because you see over time on these maps the and just go back one, the degree to which that site has been shaped by those rail lines. In fact, even back one, sorry. Look at those fanning out. And one of the interesting things, there's also the canal, the Regent's Canal going through. And this was one of the first intermodal transport exchanges where actually coal came in and was put onto barges, or beer came in and was put onto barges. In fact, there always were European lines arriving here. And rediscovering that canal interchange has been really a big part of the site. And through, and you can see it just coming through there. You all spotted it. Next. And one of the big decisions, central decisions, and I would say this is a factor that's important internationally. This project has been led by Argent, who are developers, who said from the beginning, you know what, we're in this for the long term. We want to develop this. Oh, does it take 25 years? Does it take 50 years? We're staying there. We're not selling this land. So their decision-making process has been, and their project management skills. And this is one of the huge issues, I think, internationally in delivering sustainable projects. Having a long-term view, a long-term commitment, and the capacity to deliver. In city governments, there's a lot of lack of capacity. Right, you can roll again. This is the granary building. This was the granary for London. It could hold enough grain to feed London for a week. And out the back, there were all the lines bringing it. and it will take great weights. And one of the brilliant things about this project is it's now got the University of the Arts in it, as you know. And having an educational establishment, I was thinking about it while Simon was talking, in the middle of a project means you've got all these cool kids there, they're showcasing all their ideas, talk about digital, they're right with it in lots of aspects of the arts. And here, in the back, this was where the railway line came to deliver that grain, where we're standing in these atrium spaces. And on either side, on the left, there were the weaving workshops, and on the right, there was a graphics department. So, and across the end there is their great big showcase. And if you're there, go and walk in, so you see showcases for all their departments. But there were lots of historic buildings on the site. You can see down there, that was where the barges came and the coal was delivered next. And this area is going to be the shopping area. But actually, one of the cool things about this development is that the developers have said, you know what, there's so much shopping just opened down in St Pancras, we won't open all our retail at the moment. That needs to be embedded. We will wait. And they have a great planning deal that they negotiated an absolute limit on the amount of space that they could develop. Incidentally, it's a 67-acre site. But they can decide when to bring that forward. So the whole process of building can be very responsive. You see there the train sheds that were coming behind the granary next. And of course there are gas holders, and they have all been taken down. They're coming back again next. And there will be apartments built up inside them. So planning the process started around the year 2000, and I'm talking about this because my firm, Allies and Morrison, were the master planners for this. Old-time master planners, Simon, I'm sorry. But this is, and sustainability, it was at the heart of it. So those walking times are really important to this whole project. And making public spaces of public interchange was also a hugely... this is logging where the different uses come, the different commercial uses in what was the original master plan. Of course, as it's being built out, and interestingly, these buildings at the bottom are the Google buildings. Why Google want to be there is because it's close to the end of the railway line up to Cambridge. You know, it's that linkage that and this is what happens at night time. So all these things were tested in a very flexible site plan that, you know, is kind of where they're aiming. It sets the trajectory, but it's a pretty flexible document. But one of the things that it tried to next set, and this is interesting, because they're choreographing the process. So when you're doing big development, you set off, and it's really terrible environment. You've got all these, and you go there today, it's full of cranes and so on and so forth. But they're actually introducing things that happen as part of the process. Now, they've got a very high benchmark for their sustainability project levels. But this, I just was showing you this, that in the planning of it, and in the kind of ground rules of how the development happens, this was trying to establish how you get a cone of light coming into these streets. Next, this is looking at all these different streets in London and looking at the height to width ratios and how light are they, how do you plan streets so that you actually get light, and I'm getting a long hard look, I recognise it now, that you can have naturally lit offices. There are also 2,000 homes here, and 40% of them are affordable homes. Next, next. A lot of work with the local community, very, very important. Some quite poor estates around that they had at least, they're also on the boundary between Camden and Islington, and they committed to, I just want to show you these two images, nearly finished. The site before was completely impermeable, nobody could go there. But now it becomes part of the street pattern of London. It becomes urban again. It becomes a world of streets and buildings. But the local communities, we're nearly at the end, they had 3,000 consultation meetings during the process, but they're also providing great things like there's a new primary school being built, a new school for deaf pupils. They're producing local startup grants in this square. For example, for the Wimbledon final, there were 5,000 people in there looking at the big screen. Kids have had a wonderful time this summer. So, even as it emerges, and it will keep on emerging for the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's already making a great urban contribution. And part of the sustainable agenda for urbanism is not just places, but places that people can use and enjoy and come together in that real city fabric way that actually is a really important thing that we rediscover. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Diane. And I can certify personally that it's a very pleasant development, as you didn't show it, but our offices are right in the middle of that, just by the canal. Yeah, it's a wonderful place to be. Thank you for that. We are somewhat running out of time, so do we have time for a few? We've got time for a few questions.
Yes.
Because I'm sure you've got some. I should emphasise also that our speakers are going to be around afterwards, so if you do have some other questions that we don't get round to, you will get a chance more informally afterwards. But let's get your questions now. Let's get as many as we can. A question here, I think we can take your... I think you need the microphone so that the webcast and so on can hear.
I have a question. I currently live in Germany, and they have a string of very unsuccessful urban projects. When you were talking about this, I had to think of, I had to think about this dreadful thing with like the Stuttgart train station, and I mean there's a whole string of others like the Opera House in Hamburg and the airport in Berlin, and I mean this kind of brings to me the question.
None of our panelists are actually responsible for these.
Exactly, that's my question. I mean, like if it's so important to provide those services, who should it be? I mean, because I think one of the large issues with all those big projects was sort of that they were run by politicians who sort of partly willingly, partly probably just out of, I don't know, they probably didn't know better, I don't want to use the I word, played down the costs and just mismanagement. But like, to whom should it fall to provide those projects and to manage those projects, which are so vital and which are like, as you were saying, part of the city? Who is, in this case, the city, in having both the authority and the capability to run those projects?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you very much for that. And as we don't have any politicians on the panel, I think we can all feel safe in blaming the politicians for what goes wrong. But thank you for that. That's a very good question. Who manages? We've got another one. Yeah. And yes, madam, I've seen you. We'll take you after. Oh, there. Oh, sorry. There we go.
Hi, thanks for sharing your thoughts. I had some questions picking up from some of the things that you shared, Simon, around the example you gave about Singapore and digital cities and just kind of the digital economy. And just some thoughts around where do you start if you're an emerging economy? What are the examples and the precedents that are out there? I've heard a lot about Masdar City and Dongtan City, or whatever they called it, by Arab in China. And we hear about all these iconic buildings and kind of developments going on around the world. But in my view, they remain iconic and they don't become embedded, and that's essentially where we're trying to go, right? So what's stopping us? Why are we still in this initial stage of trying to convince people that this is the way to go? Possibly is the economics, but I'd love to get your view.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very good question there as well. I'll take any more questions that you've got at the moment very quickly. If you've got a question, you better tell me now. Oh, well, go on then.
I'll give you the chance. I can pass
Yeah.
or I can always speak to them later.
Yeah, just picking up on what Simon was saying, it's sort of similar area. Is there a fine line if we went down the road Simon suggested in terms of the digital stuff where you can manage people by their phones, where they are, basically controlling people? Is there a line where we shouldn't go too far, where we're actually it's people's private lives?
Well, that's a good question, because I'm from
it's
The
actually-
Guardian, and
it's a
so I'm very keen on that question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good question. Thank you for that. Very finally, one more. I'll take you, sir. Any other bids? Yeah. Right. Oh, one at the back. I'll take you after this one. But yeah.
A lot of the discussion focused on new build, I think, but in 50 years' time, much of the infrastructure would be the same infrastructure we have today. So retrofitting for sustainability is quite important. How do you think about that?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. And the very last one. You've got in just under the wire.
So this question is for Linda. You guys were talking about how to build on the cities, you have to think about the uncertainties that developing countries face. And in the development in the King's Cross, she was saying that it was very important for the management to have a long-term project and to be very dedicated to the project and to be able to deliver. So how would you mitigate these two things in a developing country where you're facing so much uncertainty, not just politically, but with the society and with everything else?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Right, I'm going to put these questions to our panellists. So you've got to answer these questions, and it's your final word. You don't all have to answer all of the questions. Some of them are obviously more relevant to different people. We had the developing country question just now, so I think maybe we'll take that first, and then we'll move on to the question of sort of government. And other politicians or the architects and so on in control. I'll give that to you, Diane, and Simon. Perhaps some of these philosophical questions around the digital city might go to you last. So please, Linda. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very technical question. Arguably, this cannot happen without having to do probabilistic analysis. That's where uncertainty analysis comes from. Probabilistic analysis of what we project in terms of economic development, and project all these random and sometimes random trajectories that may happen in a developing country, economic, social developments, physical developments, climatic changes, and all this, and do that in parallel with building performance. And that's the only way you can identify the consequences of dealing with all these uncertainties. What's the consequence of dealing with this route of, say, economic development route on building performance? What's the consequence of taking this other route in building performance? And that will help quantify the consequences of dealing with all these uncertainties and give you a chance to explore interventions on how to deal with them and identify what uncertainty is most important to deal with, and prioritize what and when, and answer all these questions. And that's, I think, the only way to go up. I think one of the ways to go about it. I hope I've answered your question. Yeah. And I wish to talk to you about this later in land. Yeah.
And you're very welcome to have a final word on any of the other questions that you're, because I know I put that very specifically to you, but if there's a final word you'd like to have, then...
Well, you asked me earlier why are we not building green if we know that buildings contribute to a third of CO2 that causes global warming. I think in developing countries, and especially third world countries in Africa, sustainability has taken a backseat. No one thinks it's important. And especially, there has been awareness of importance of low carbon emission reduction, but there hasn't been awareness of the importance of reducing this carbon emission, especially through building green or sustainable building. And that's why we're not moving forward in this. And I think one of the ways we were discussing with my supervisor is to take a military approach to it. And in the same way we don't question structural stability when we're building in seismic regions, for example. You don't question how much steel you use in a volcanic or a place that is not structurally, as ground is not stable. In that same way, we need to treat the green building mandates as the building code. That's the only way we can move forward, I think, in this.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Diane, we had some questions there. Well, specifically, I'd like you to look first of all at this question of, are the politicians in charge, or should the architects stage a coup?
I want to introduce the notion of master planning as a process and not a product. That actually it's to do with how you agree your aims for starters, but also as how you design a process that includes involvement and consultation. Because the way round has been that you come along with a huge model and plans and this is it and it's either that or nothing. If you actually don't start with that physical model, you actually start with thinking and introducing some of the digital city thinking, but and start with discussing really what the brief is. And it may be that in Stuttgart they should keep the Jolly station. It shouldn't get to that kind of position. And that you understand, you empower communities by giving them good information. You don't keep it all quiet, but you engage them as mature partners. Now, inevitably, it has rocky moments, and this is what politics is about. But I think there are really quite a few projects that have a different approach to that. And people actually think about designing the process before they design the product. I think that's quite powerful. I was teaching in the States last year, and it's very interesting how community involvement there is huge, and quite often in our terms kind of stymies development, because actually it still tends to be in this country that you do come along with your plan, then you ask people, but you're willing to change if they say, well, actually, left hand down a bit. And so that I think around the world there's actually quite an interesting sort of emerging field in community empowerment in which digital information can play quite a part. And I'm just thinking one of the interesting things in the computer labs here, Andy Hopper, as well actually for some time, they've had digital cameras, they now have it in West Cambridge, that can show you whether the meeting rooms are empty or used, or whether people are working from home or whatever. And it makes a very flexible workspace that actually everybody's linked in, and you can have meetings, but some people will be in other places. And of course we can do that now perfectly easily. So it means spatial definition is really different from the physical environments we've been talking about. And the need to travel is really different. So I think there are lots of interesting things emerging in the urban field.
But when it comes down to an actual decision on, a bit of urban planning, who should make the final decision? Is it the politicians who should make the final decision? Is it the architects, the engineers? Is it the local community?
Of course, in a democracy, politicians should be representing the people in their constituency.
Well, we all hope for that state of affairs at some point. Yes.
But in a more collaborative environment, it tends to be that the role of the community is reduced to that of NIMBYs saying no. It can't be on that basis, because actually for a place like King's Cross, and the local community had already over the decades seen off schemes. Lord Rogers had done a scheme, no, it was Lord Foster had done a scheme some decades before, and they had seen it off. So, you know, communities can see off schemes, but in a way then you still have that gaping hole of an unused site that can be used.
And who is the local community in a case like that? Because you could argue that commuters form as much of a community.
Right. And they're part of networks, and there's an ongoing discussion with the people that live within a certain band. And just very interestingly, we had some guys come from Prague the other day, where they were trying to redevelop a station, a bit like Stuttgart. The local community had said, actually, you know what, we don't want this station pulled down. It's a really great place. For Prague, this was something really new. They're saying, oh, shit, now there's a station there. But, you know, that needs to be, we were encouraging them to engage and say, okay, what do we mean by that station staying there? And you can see from the University of the Arts that actually it's rather fantastic that what they've done with what were platforms and train sheds. It's, you know, you can think of new typologies which are also low energy. So I think the field's very open at the minute. It's quite interesting. And purposefully, I hope, open to respond to these sustainability issues. But I do think King's Cross is quite a good example.
Thank you very much, and we can all see your work every time we get the
train
train
from
from
Cambridge.
Cambridge.
Go back.
Simon, finally, I'll give you your final words, but also I'd specifically like you to address this question of, you know, are we, in a digital city, are we masters or slaves?
Okay, so I think there are two ways of tackling the question. So there was the first question, which was about what's the role of digital in the emerging markets, and you know, is this just a developed economy opportunity? So I'll tackle that one. The second one, I'd actually like to talk more broadly about institutions. Actually,
you're going to do all of this very, very quickly, I should add.
The second point is about are the civic institutions that we have fit for purpose for the current environment? I think that comes to the question of both privacy, data privacy. Do we have the right civic institutions to deal with the digital economy within the city? But also from a planning perspective, just coming to that point about, you know, are our civic institutions for planning fit for purpose for the current environment? So I guess the first question about kind of the role in emerging markets. About 50% of my work is in emerging markets. So I've done a lot of work recently in Brazil and in Colombia. Colombia is a perfect example. I think what you really need to understand is a combination of how do the needs of emerging market cities differ from developed market cities. The second question is how does the technology environment differ? And in the first point, what we always try to do is understand what are the main challenges that are facing the civic population within a city, and how could we deploy digital technologies to solve those problems. So the first part is about going out, listening and engaging. So doing the social anthropology to understand, you know, if I'm going to, you know, Bogota, in Bogota, you know, the nature of the challenges that are facing different population demographic segments within Bogota are completely different to London. So there's no point in bringing the same solutions I have in London and trying to deploy them in Bogota. So what we need to understand is healthcare and education are key issues, certainly in those markets. But also, you know, the type of mobility and transportation issues are often even more acute. So I do a lot of work in Sao Paulo and Rio. You know, trying to get around Sao Paulo and Rio is a real challenge. If you look at this in 20 years' time, with the advent of an emerging middle class, a rapidly emerging middle class, where one of the first activities of achieving a certain level of status is to buy a car, and then you spend all your time in the car, it actually makes transportation and mobility even worse, right? So one option is I build lots of big infrastructure to deal with that. So I build big roads, big tunnels. It's extremely expensive. So then the question is, how could I deploy sensing and digital technologies to better optimize the infrastructure that I already have, rather than having to build new infrastructure from scratch? So a lot of the issues that we're facing, we're trying to say, well, how could I deploy technologies in a smart way to tackle those types of issues? Another issue, I was in a place called Bucaramanga, not many people would know it, but it's in a seismic part of Colombia. Their issue is, seismic sensors cost between $20,000 and $30,000 a pop to put in place. And when they do put them in, they can't maintain them very effectively. So what they challenged me with was, well, look, mobile phones are pretty prevalent around the space. A lot of them have accelerometers within the phone. Are there apps that you could develop that, whilst phones are passive on a table, have a relatively low, use the accelerometer to be able to identify seismic activity? Now, obviously, it's not as sensitive as a seismic sensor, like a proper seismic sensor, but you could easily develop an app to be able to deal with that. Now, they have these things called P waves and S waves, right? A P wave is the first wave of a big seismic event, but actually the damage is done by the secondary wave. There can be up to 5 to 10 seconds between those two waves. If I could pick up some level of sensing that gives me a 5 to 10 second gap and warning, that's enough time to get under a table or in a door jam. So just thinking really practically about that is really important. Understand the issues, and then understand the technology constraints. In emerging markets, the best delivery mechanism is mobile phones. Right? So I could talk way more about the case studies around that. Just very quickly, in terms of the institutions,
Very quickly.
I think really clearly, like, institutions now aren't fit for purpose. And that is both in terms of the development context, but also in terms of the way that they deal with digital. Cities have no concept of how and what they do within the concept of the digital economy. So we've got to deal with that question of developing new institutions, frameworks, and governance to deal with that. In terms of the development context, how you engage civil society is absolutely critical. Digital technologies can play a significant role in that. Amsterdam is a really good case study of how they do civic engagement around the development context much more effectively. But not only that, being able to put out 3D visualizations of what a development will look like and enabling people to visualize and interact with the development is an important part of that process. And if anyone can catch me over drinks or dinner, I'll talk about a case study in Mexico where, rather than the dominant development paradigm being politicians and real estate developments who have a very cozy relationship often in both developed and developing economies, what we did was try to say, well, rather than a big real estate developer getting land very cheap and then capturing most of the economic profit over the life cycle of the development, could we create a land bank where the land is acquired on the behalf of the community and then set up a developer, like a development organization that is able to develop on the behalf of civic society and engage with developers on a parcelized basis within the land structure, right? So there are really good opportunities and innovative governance structures about how we could do development more effectively to engage civil society. We just have to think way more creatively about it.
Okay, so a call for more creativity there. And thank you for your excellent and very to-the-point questions. Thank you to our panelists for their answers. I think the conclusion I've come to is that the only way to live sustainably is to be in a beautiful medieval city that has a wonderful real link to a very sustainable new development in King's Cross. And luckily that's where we are. Thank you very much for your fantastic questions. We're going to have a few words about what's going to happen next in terms of your networking and so on and the rest of your alumni weekend. But before we do that, can I just ask you to thank our panelists who've been marvellous. Thank you.
That was exciting. Sorry as we are to see this event come to an end. Discussions will carry on at dinner and drinks, so please take part in that. But before we end, two messages. One, a big round of applause for Jim to put the system together and sitting there behind the screen. I'm sure he's going to have cramps. The second thing is I would like to encourage you to participate and volunteer to run events such as these. This wouldn't have been possible because a lot of people have put in their effort and time. And there are ways around how to do it. Please come and contact me or talk to me about it, and I'll tell you how you can get connected. So that's the only way to be connected and remain in touch with your friends. Right. And so now it's party time.